welcome to the Wormhole Podcast. I'm Charlie Place, and joining me today is Fran Cooper, author of the quiet but brilliant and frankly poetic and unique novels These Dividing Walls and The Two Houses. Hello, Fran.
Hello, thank you for that lovely intro.
You are welcome. Did you have a good time in Italy?
I did. I am just back from a few days in the sun with, lots of lovely things to look at and lots of lovely Italian food. But it's nice to dive back into things, talking about the books.
So you read English at Cambridge. Who was most interesting to study?
That is a great question. And I was thinking about it in preparation for this. And I think I have to say it was a paper that I did in my last year. It was called International Literature in English. So it looked at a lot of Commonwealth writers, a lot of writers from all over the world, but writing in English. And, you know, these were by no means the most famous writers on the course. I have to say it wasn't Shakespeare, it wasn't kind of John Donne or anyone like that. But those were the stories that really stuck with me. I think they were some of the most powerful stories and some of the most compelling.
So you were learning about authors outside of the canon?
Yeah, absolutely. And authors writing about things like diaspora or, the after effects of empire. I looked in particular at Caribbean and South African and Indian literature and literary voices. And I don't know, I would say it was one paper and one term, but those are the things I find myself coming back to the most, which I would never have guessed at the time.
It's lovely to hear, because that's one thing that I know lots of people say about with study, isn't it? They say we study the canon and we want to study more modern things or just something that's not white people, basically. So that's really good to hear.
Right. And it really, necessarily, reading English at Cambridge is very, very skewed in that direction. And I suppose there is something actually kind of really nice about looking back now, sort of a decade later, and thinking, it was that paper and those voices that have really stayed with me.
So we need to ask, because of These Dividing Walls being set in Paris, are there any French classics that you particularly enjoy?
Oh my goodness, that's a great question. I mean, I did read some French books at uni. I would say that Flaubert's short stories were ones that I really enjoyed. Interesting because you introduced the books as being kind of quiet stories, and I would say that to me always felt true in the bits of Flaubert that I've read. And I cannot claim to be any kind of great expert, but the things that we were looking at were actually kind of quite quiet, everyday stories, which I guess I've always been drawn to. There's a wonderful, wonderful book whose English title is The Lady's Paradise. And I always trip up on whether it's by Zola or another writer, but it's The Lady's Paradise. And it's a 19th century novel about a department store in Paris, just at the point when department stores were being founded and they were seen as kind of these juggernauts destroying all the local shops and all the little individual people. And that has been one of my favourite French books. It's just beautiful. It's so well written.
Yes, you say that. I haven't read it myself. I haven't read any, actually, but I think that is Zola. Yeah.
Yes. Well, that makes me feel better. I never, ever remember, and I always rave about it. So it's just embarrassing because I should write it on my hand or something.
So before we get to your books, are you a city or a country person?
Such a good question. I mean, by life, city, because I live in London, and I think a lot of my life is very urban, and I'm always taking the tube and things like that. But in my heart, I sort of love wide, empty, desolate spaces, which is in a way sort of the story of the two books. One's very much about a city and one's very much not. So I suppose my answer is I'm still working that out.
And to clarify, listeners, what Fran's just said is exactly why I asked it, because of her books, her two books, Country and City. So, I mean, both your books deal with community change and newcomers. Would it be right to assume that you or someone you know has had the experience of moving somewhere with towards an established community?
Yeah, I think that is right. I moved to Paris when I was studying and literally knew two people in the city, and that felt pretty crazy to me as a 25-year-old to kind of rock up somewhere new and not have any links or any sort of establishment or family or anything like that around me. My parents also moved to the US for a while when I was growing up. So I think we had the opportunity of kind of being, not outsiders in a kind of excluded sort of way, but that opportunity to arrive somewhere and see it through different eyes that aren't used to it. I think that probably is something that's really affected my writing.
And do you speak French? I'm guessing you're quite fluent.
I wouldn't, I mean, yeah, I do speak French. Fluent. I think it's very dangerous to say that you're fluent because then someone will start talking to you in French and you go, oh my God, I can't remember anything.
That's fine. That's not going to happen here.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I am. I mean, but I've got quite weird French. When I was there, I was studying the 18th century. So some of my French, I'm told, sounds like I'm an 18th century nun. Some of it is quite kind of like 90s groovy parlance, like things that I would have learned at school. So I'm told I've got quite strange French. But I can get by. I can have an argument in French, so that's always a good measure.
It's good to listen to. I would like to listen to that, but I wouldn't understand a word of it, I expect. Anyway,
well, you'd be with the French on that, possibly.
Maybe. So, getting on to your books, These Dividing Walls, it's your first novel, and it's actually quite nice that it's easy to kind of give a summary without any spoilers. It's essentially about a building full of apartments, and you get to hear about all the different people who live in the different apartments. And it's a lot more than that, needless to say. And you have a reading from the very beginning, I think, Fran.
Yes, I've got it from not the very, very beginning, but about page 4 in the book that I'm looking at. So right near the start. 4 o'clock, and Edward stands outside his new building in a new city, breathing damp summer deep into his lungs. He doesn't know where the bins are yet, so he's left his bag of rubbish out on the deserted street. No one stirs. There's no one to stir, just lines of buildings flanked by parked cars. He thinks back to the conversation he had with Emily, standing barefoot in thick grass, the scent of hay heavy in his nostrils, pollen dancing in the golden air. I need to get out, Em. Edward! That tone she uses in exasperation, usually accompanied by the flailing of a densely bangled wrist. He'd imagined the clink and jingle of it down the phone, metal on metal via metal, her handset to his, cheek to cheek across hundreds of miles of ether. Use the apartment, please. No one's going to mind. My aunt's probably not even there. I'll get the gardienne to let you in, or there'll be some old voisin with a key. Edward didn't know what those words meant, but in the sunshine, with the bright timpani of her voice, her laugh, the surety with which she described it all, he was swept up on it, up on the cloud of her, and he'd agreed and bought a ticket, and it was less than 3 days ago, and now here he is in Paris, on a street, in the early hours of a Friday morning. And not the Paris he knew about, either. This is no boulevard, no landmarks here. The night before, the bus had dropped him at the back end of a car park behind a shopping centre. Shrieking teenagers with backpacks, an Orthodox Jewish couple and their impossibly tiny baby, a crumpled old man with a stick who'd immediately struck out in the opposite direction to everybody else. Edward had followed the crowd as it trailed its way through back doors and featureless corridors down into the metro, where he jumped the stile like everyone in front of him, right in front of the guard, her eyes glazed and vacant, and then onto a train, which hurtled past names that meant something to him. Champs-Élysées, Musée du Louvre, before changing onto one whose names did not. He emerged into streets filled with end-of-day crowds, the directions he'd scribbled down smearing on his damp palm as he navigated old women with shopping trolleys, kids streaking past on scooters, greengrocers waving bags of overripe cherries in his face, their bloody juice dripping vivid onto the pavement, while outside a butcher's shop 2 men hurled grease from a rotisserie oven into the road so that the ground swam with fat and soapsuds. Wide women waddled past, wrapped head to toe in neon prints. A teenager rode a motorbike along the pavement, a friend standing on the seat behind him, and Edward, a country boy, reeled. Now, though, the streets are quiet. Edward takes a few tentative steps, but the morning light is taking its time today, and unease coats the base of his still jittery stomach. He is turning back to the building, to the great turquoise doorway that leads into the courtyard, when he hears it, could swear he hears it. Edward. His name whispered quick, urgent, carried on the air from the empty street. He looks but sees nothing, hears only the rush of blood to his head. He slams the door, crosses the courtyard, and takes the 5 flights of stairs at a run.
The background to this book, obviously, we've talked about, French and being in Paris. Was there a particular event or anything that inspired the book?
It's a very good question. I would say not so much one event as a sort of set of circumstances. There are several English language poetry open mic nights in Paris at various different bars, all of them kind of grimy but utterly charming. And at all of these, you get 5 minutes on a stage, very tightly timed 5 minutes, in which you can do whatever you like. And most people read poems or bring their guitars and sing songs. And I cannot sing and I cannot write poetry to save my life. So I started writing very, very, very short vignettes. It's really hard to tell a beginning, middle, and end of a story in 5 minutes. I guess it's like flash fiction in a way. And I really enjoyed doing it, and it was terrifying, but it was really good for me, and I loved the community. And so I built up this sort of group of vignettes, most of which, because it was Paris, were around apartment buildings. And, you know, I was studying. I didn't know that many people, but I was living in an apartment building and looking out and, you know, imagining all the lives of all the people around me, people that you'd hear but you wouldn't see. You know, you'd hear arguments or you'd hear coughing or you'd kind of get a sense of what was happening, but you never met any of the people. And so, yeah, these dividing walls really came out of a desire actually to knit that together into one novel. Because what if you did put all those people in one building? Would it work? So that's kind of where that came from.
So was this your first kind of foray into writing in this manner?
Definitely my first foray into novel writing. I feel like most writers start out writing short stories because they're under the illusion or delusion that they're easier. They're shorter. I don't actually think they are easier. And I was very lucky. There was a free mentoring program running when I was doing this, and I ended up being mentored by a Scottish novelist called Lisa O'Donnell, who is absolutely fantastic. And, you know, I said to her, oh, well, I thought I'd write a collection of short stories. And she just sort of said, do you ever read collections of short stories? And I went, ooh, no. She was like, no, neither does anyone else. They don't sell them. Nobody buys them. Write a novel. Do it as a novel, which was sort of the kind of confidence and the kick up the derriere, if you will, that I needed to sort of be brave and just do it as the novel, which I think was absolutely the right decision.
That is a sad but true fact about story collections.
Right. And it's very funny because I know so many writers, you know, want to be writers who write them. And I'm really not convinced that many people read them. But it's, you know, it's the idea that shorter is easier. And actually, you know, it's not a brilliant short story. I think it's much harder to write than a novel. It's a misapprehension.
So are there any buildings that are particularly important to you in this sense of a residence?
I mean, there's no one particular building in Paris that's exactly like the one in the book, the number 37, which is the building of the book. But there were definitely, you know, I was lucky enough to live in one place for 3 years, and that apartment building, which had 2 buildings across a courtyard, which is very common, that definitely informed a lot of the book because that's just where I was. My now husband had a sublet one summer right up under the eaves of a building on the other side of Paris, up like something like 9 flights of stairs, and that's where Edward's room is. Edward's room is sort of loosely based on that in my imagination. But I don't know. I think the experience of living in Paris and being in my building, but also visiting friends, it's kind of the same everywhere. Everyone has like strange neighbours that they hear but don't see, and the kind of people they pass fleetingly in the corridors. You know, it's this very intimate thing, and yet you don't know them. So my idea was that it wouldn't really be kind of a faithful rendition of one building, but you know, if you'd ever been to Paris or seen a Parisian apartment building, it might feel kind of familiar.
So this is where we need to go into a bit more in depth into the book, listeners. Why Paris rather than England, given the circumstances are similar, and obviously you could have written about a block of flats in England. Why France?
Well, I think on the one hand, the simple fact that that's where I was, and you know, I think everyone to some extent writes about where they are in their experience. But I think, to be honest, the real answer for that goes back to what you were asking about before in terms of, you know, being an outsider or a newcomer, or having the experience of going somewhere and being new. That was very much my experience moving to Paris, and to me that is really fascinating. Someone who comes in and sees everyday life but with a new kind of lens. I also felt, you know, I couldn't really write a book as a French person because I'm not a French person, and I wasn't someone who'd grown up in that culture. But what I loved in the idea of Edward being this young English man who's suffered a terrible bereavement and moves to Paris, on this crazy whim. What I loved about that was the idea of seeing the city through his eyes, someone who kind of doesn't really understand what's going on around him, but is beguiled by it and intrigued by it and occasionally kind of appalled by it. So I guess that's really why it's France, not England, is I wasn't in England and I wasn't sort of being inspired by all the things around me, I guess, at that time.
So in the book, there is terrorism on various sides. Can we talk about this in terms of, obviously, it's a factual thing that happens, and also you've created some as well?
Yeah, so one of the kind of strange things about writing in a contemporary world is that sometimes life mirrors fiction in a way that's sort of a bit uncomfortable. As an outsider living in Paris, one of the things that fascinated me was that people have this very particular view of Paris. They think it's very romantic, that it's baguettes and chocolate boxes and women in berets having these wonderful love affairs. And, there is a lot about Paris that is very romantic like that. But going there as an outsider, I was really shocked by the levels of homelessness, the racial segregation. Paris is a very racially segregated city, and all the suburbs outside it are very deprived and very much stereotype of what we think Paris is going to be like. And especially moving there in 2012, I was really shocked at the rise of the far right. And I lived quite near one of the main kind of protest routes for the far right, and was really shocked that there would be what looked to me like very middle-class teenage boys out on a Saturday afternoon waving the flag to say we should get rid of abortion, or no immigrants, or let's make France white again. And I guess I wanted to tell that story. I wanted to kind of look at this other side of Paris. And then as part of that, I'd kind of plotted out the book and thought, this is set over the course of a very hot, very kind of politically turbulent summer. I think something might happen. I think there might be like a terrorist event or something like that. And actually, it was only when the book was written and I was in the editing stage, and I'd got an agent at that point, that the terrible Charlie Hebdo attacks happened. And so the only thing that that wasn't me mirroring reality. It was in a horrible way that reality was mirroring what had gone in the book. And the only thing I ended up changing in the book was a larger number of casualties, because actually particularly after the attacks in the November at the Bataclan, which was so terrible, it felt very trite to be talking about, one or two people being killed, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Edward and Frederique, they have both experienced a loss. They are both grieving. Frederique, her relationship and her child, and Edward is his sister. What for you was the significance of these two characters, kind of both experiencing this grief and living together, coming together, sort of thing?
In terms of Frederique and Edward both having suffered a loss, I suppose, in part it was a way to link them together, to kind of give them this connection, because obviously they're different ages and they come from different worlds. I guess I'm very interested in the fact that, we meet so many people in everyday life, and it's not that often that you get the chance to actually kind of pause and consider, who they are and what their story is. And actually, I think if we did that more, we'd realize that huge numbers of people are dealing with loss in some way or another, whether with like Edward and Frederique, it's a loss of something very concrete. One of the other characters in the book has lost a job and doesn't know how to cope with that. Someone else is sort of losing her identity because she's had children, and she's very kind of caught up in that, and she doesn't know who she is anymore. So theirs is a kind of similar loss because it's a bereavement. But I think the beauty of getting to sit and write about characters over a period of time is you can kind of explore the things that you find interesting. So that's what I want to do when I meet people, really. I'm just really nosy. I just kind of want to know all the things that have gone on in their lives.
So you're the person on the train who's kind of wondering about all the different houses and who lives there?
Yes, 100%. Listening to everyone's conversations. I mean, this is a building about an apartment a novel about an apartment building, because I was, sticking my head out the window, watching everybody going around going, I'm really interested in that. I'm really nosy. My advice to writers is be nosy. That's my top tip.
No, I mean, you saying what you have about, what's going on in different people's lives. That was something that, I mean, obviously, when I opened your book, I was really excited about this idea of it being an apartment building with loads of different people, and just hearing that, because there is a lot of normality about that, and kind of just the everyday, the same old, same old. And at the same time, obviously, I think what your book definitely does really well is show that actually behind all that idea of same old, and all those people live there, and all those people live there, everybody's lives are so full. And there is so much going on in different people's worlds, which is something that I really, I love that about the book. It was excellent. That, yeah.
Well, thank you, because that's definitely something I was, trying to bring out. So that's lovely to hear.
So, I mean, you talk about depression as postpartum depression. You've got this idea of in there that the mother being invisible. She's no longer a person of her own when the children are there. This whole idea of children being cute and the mum's kind of the mother. And you've mentioned it just previously. And I mean, don't want to talk too much about the two houses yet, but there's a little bit of that kind of thread in there. Is this motherhood and the issues of motherhood particularly important to you as an issue to discuss?
I mean, I think one of the very strange things about writing books is that you write the stories you're interested in, and then smart people come and read them and then ask you these questions. And you think, oh my God, is that something I'm really interested in? I don't know if you asked me 3 years ago, is that something you're really interested in? I don't know what I would have said about that. But I do think we all, well, I can't speak for anybody else, but I think I write, kind of in the world that I'm in, and I don't have children, but I'm in my early 30s and can see people around me having children or thinking about having children. And, my mum worked when I was growing up and had children. And I think that was very difficult for her at certain times, though she did it with tremendous grace and made it look effortless. So I suppose it is something I'm interested in because, I feel like it's something that's not particularly talked about. And yet it's something that I feel like I see in lots of people, whether they're colleagues or friends or just the kind of people around me. There's this kind of the kind of pushing out of the mother's own identity. Plus, most people who buy books in this country and read books in this country are women. When I do events or I go and talk to people, the vast majority of them are women, and it feels like people have actually been very complimentary about those storylines, as opposed to kind of saying, oh, it's just really boring, it's just kind of everyday stuff.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, it gets talked about, but it's sometimes, I suppose, people can say, oh, we talk about it a lot, but we don't. In a way, we don't talk about it in depth enough. So yeah.
Well, and I think golly, there's still things like the Bechdel test. If you watch a movie or read a book, and are there moments where two women will be talking to each other about things that aren't to do with a man, and we still fall down on that, and I find that baffling, but we do. So
we're doing it right now.
So there we go.
We are two women, and we're not talking about men right now.
It's true, but we need more of that, is I guess my feeling.
Definitely. Frederique, on a different subject completely, Frederique has a husband and see with her child and the death, and her husband and she have a strange living arrangement. Was there an inspiration for this at all? Because it is a very interesting kind of idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know that I'm not sure that I'd call it a living arrangement. To me, I always thought of it as more like people who can't live together and can't live apart. And what would that be like, and it's a line that gets used a lot in movies, but I guess I was interested in what that would be within the realms of a building. And, there was someone who used to live in the neighborhood in which I lived, a man, middle-aged, very well presented, moved all his belongings around on a trolley, and yet did so with great dignity and grace, and kept himself incredibly presentable and was very courteous. And I remember always being fascinated by that, and what was that like to sort of effectively live on the streets, but in a way that seemed very much of his own choosing, or in a way in which he had kind of made his world within that, but made it very successfully. So I guess I was interested in that, and I took little bits of that when thinking about Joseph.
So the two houses. Shall we start with the reading?
Absolutely. Now, this is from the very beginning. The two houses sit grey and brooding beneath a pale sky. They cling to the hillside, cowering from the wind, because always, before everything up here, there is the wind. In the not quite light of a November afternoon, this whole strange world is beaten by it. The spindly trees, the long sedge grasses, even the houses themselves seem to bend under its assault. The two houses were not always two. But if it is human to build, even up here in this blasted northern hinterland, it is human to break, too. And he could not have known the man whose hand carved 1712 in deep, angular strokes above the doorway, that his work would both last and not last. For it is more than 300 years that this wind and these stones have been battering each other, more than 300 journeys around the sun, and still his stones stand. But the middle of his house is missing. Its central rooms have been cut out, removed, sliced clean away as if a stinking wound or canker. His one great house, rent and rendered into two. Jay walks out into the space between, into the gap between the two houses that, in 1712, were built as one. A house so haunted, the locals say, that its last owner simply took out the middle, took out the rooms where objects hurled themselves across the carpet, and dogs whimpered, and even in the heat of summer, what summer there is up on these hills, the air could on a sudden turn to clouded ice in front of you. One house made two, void and vacuum in between. Bad things happened here, they murmur. This is bad land. Jay walks out into the space between because it is in this space that the builders have been digging. Because wouldn't it be perfect, they said, to have her studio here, to connect the two houses, to bring them together again. And Simon, with his architect's brain, with his love of stone and glass and building, had eagerly put pen to paper. Up here, high above the world, the rain is as relentless as the wind. In the silence of the fading year, Jay has been making a taxonomy of it. Thin rain, fat rain, rain that doesn't fall but hangs like a shroud, rain that drives itself horizontal, pricking needles into the skin. Today it drips, ticklingly slow down the back of her neck, catching dew-like in her hair and eyelashes. You see everything and nothing from two houses. Everything because they sit above the valley road, looking out over the sweep of empty hillside. Nothing because the village is further up the dale, hidden, and it's 10 miles to town the other way. They are the only souls for miles, Jay and Simon, the builder and his lad. There are spades lying on the earth between the houses, a digger, abandoned, its claw limp against the ground. Beyond the damp, Jay can smell the wetness of newly churned soil, its rich secrets meeting air for the first time. Jay, it is Simon, hovering behind her somewhere. He's always so sensible, her Simon. Maybe you shouldn't. But it is too late. Her fingers have touched it, this strange, unearthly protrusion from the land at which they are all looking. And as they do, everything swims into crystalline focus, every sharp intake of breath when the two houses are mentioned, each darkly guarded reference to the things that happened here. Suddenly, she understands. Behind her, the builder's lad retches. The smell of his soured breakfast carries on the bitter air, and a new silence descends as they wait, held in uneasy tableau around the unburied earth. For there is no doubting it now. This thing beneath her fingers has the irrefutable hardness of bone.
So this story is, it begins with Jay and Simon. They are Londoners, and they are moving north to a village that doesn't really exist, I believe. I believe you've made it, Fran?
I have made it up, yep.
And they are leaving there. They are an artist and an architect because Jay's mental health is suffering, and so they have bought these houses. So Fran, you talk about these two houses being one house rent in two and the gap between them. And there is a short scene in These Dividing Walls where Edward is recounting a story of his sister who had gone in between this couple of houses that used to be one house. And it seems very similar. Was the two houses inspired by this background for Edward?
Yes and no. So 10 out of 10, well done, because lots of people hadn't noticed the link between the two, the secret link. I would say the two houses is not inspired by that. Rather, both are inspired by a set of two houses that I know about in a very remote corner of Yorkshire that we used to go on holiday to as children all the time. And the story I was always told as a child was that the middle had been cut out because they were haunted. And I guess that always fascinated me, why you would go to such crazy, crazy length to divide a house in two, not just to build a wall, but to actually tear down the bit in the middle. So, I guess that was something I always wanted to write about.
It does sound creepy. I mean, have you had any experiences there yourself? Or anyone you know?
Oh, no. I mean, they're two separate houses with a little garden fence running between them, and they're just like private homes now. I mean, I should probably send them a copy of the book and just be like, by the way, this is really inspirational to me, but it's maybe a bit weird. I don't know.
There's a fair amount of foresight in this book. You've got the use on the first page, I believe, on the first couple of pages, crack, break, rupture and ruin, which corresponds to the names of the forthcoming sections of your book. What was it like working with this foresight, and did any changes need to be made?
Oh, massive changes. I mean, there's always loads of editing. I would say that there is a phrase, isn't there, about, or she's experiencing this breakdown, and she's a ceramicist, so she's spent her life making and breaking things, and there is this line about crack, break, rupture, ruin, and I don't know, my memory is that came quite early on in the writing process, and then that felt to me like those would be the section titles, as it were, kind of, not chapter titles, but sort of section titles. But there was an awful lot of editing and rewriting and moving things around that went into making that work.
Mm-hmm. I actually wondered if it was the reverse, actually, that came the sections and then, you adding it in later or something.
No, that I think was in the first bit of something that I wrote when thinking about the story. I think that line was in there. So it was just one that stuck. So
I know in your various biographies in the back of the book and that, you have an interest in art, you've studied it. And obviously, we have got this almost this further relationship between your books with Jay as a ceramicist, and Frederique's got an art bookshop, which obviously, she's not an artist herself, but there's a little bit there. What is your particular interest in art?
It's what I've studied. It's work in the art world as my day job when I'm not writing. So I don't know. I suppose it's as if, you had a writer who was a huge football fan and their characters were all football fans or football coaches or something. I suppose that's the only parallel I can think of it, that it's kind of the world that I'm in. And I guess I had never really thought about the two of them being similar. To me, I love poking around art bookshops, so that would be what Frederique would own. But for Jay, I think I was, very interested in, what it means to be someone who makes things. And I can write, but I can't make anything physical with my hands. And I found the world of pottery and ceramics and kind of taking something out of clay, to be so poetic and interesting. So I guess I just really went down that rabbit hole.
And do you have a favourite artist?
Oh my gosh.
Should we say pick three? Would that be easier?
Okay. If I have to pick three artists, they're going to be like super obscure, strange ones, but there's a fantastic 17th century French painter called Georges de la Tour, who paints lots of scenes by candlelight, which I love. Probably Vermeer, because everybody loves Vermeer because he's amazing. And a Danish painter called Hammershøi, who's super niche. But yeah, that would be my the weird trio of artists.
But that first one about painting in candlelight, astonishing, really. Yes.
They are, and it's very hard. The room is lit by a single candle, and you're trying to paint that effect. No, it's very, very magnetizing, hypnotic, I would say.
Something else that is sort of between both your books, there seems to be a metaphor of broken items, broken things, the metaphors of the psychological in a human mind. Is there anything to this, or am I completely barking up the wrong tree?
You tell you what, you are a very attentive reader. No, I mean, I think that's probably absolutely right. I think the strange thing to me is that if I'm writing, I don't sit down and think that's what I'm going to do the metaphors of it. So it's actually the nicest thing is when someone has read the books and comes and they notice these things which I wouldn't necessarily have picked out myself. So no, I think you're absolutely right. I wouldn't say that's something that I kind of sat down with a to-do list to kind of make sure it was there. Do you know what I mean? But I think I definitely see why you would say that. Yeah.
Well, there definitely is a sort of Well, not an exact follow-on, but that sort of idea between your books that's really lovely. It is. I mean, I'm going to ask you later what you're writing next, but I kind of almost want you to say, it's linked, or even if it isn't linked, I'm sure it'll be great anyway. But it's just lovely. So
thank you.
So you've got this interest in smaller stories, well, smaller in quotes, I suppose. The stories that seem everyday until you look beyond the surface. Is that an interest to your own reading?
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember being like my early teens and saying to my mum, I love books and films that are just like a slow, sad story. I have such a vivid memory of saying that to her. And I think, I don't know whether my books would be described like that, but, these kind of small moments to me, I'm not a great one for kind of action or epics or anything like that. It's the kind of human stories I think that I'm interested in. And, therefore, it's the kind of thing I end up writing about because, you do spend a hell of a lot of time with these characters when you're writing. So I think it probably has to be something that you yourself are interested in. Otherwise, you'd go completely nutty.
Mm-hmm. So both your books have like divisions in relationships. And I mean, you have got these titles, the dividing walls and this house into, this concept of a division. What's most important to you when you are exploring these issues in relationships?
Oh, that's a great question. I suppose, especially with these books where there's the kind of ensemble cast, and so you get everything from different points of view, I guess one of the things I'm most interested in is complexity, if that makes sense. I think a lot of times, TV, not so much. I think people are making really ambitious TV and films now and writing really ambitious books. But I think we have this idea that things are really one-sided, that if a marriage breaks up, one person's had an affair, that is bad, or this person is good, or this person told a lie or kept a secret or whatever. And I think we have a tendency to boil everything down to kind of very black and white. And I guess what I'm interested in is the gray area. And yes, these kind of divisions, these separations between people, but Jay and Simon buy the two houses and clearly their marriage is on the rocks and they're two people who love each other but are in the kind of desperate difficulty. But it's not the kind of plate throwing, slanging match drama. It's the sort of everyday. And I guess I'm interested in that because to me it feels closer to what life is like. If you're with somebody for a long time, it seems inevitable that there'd be good times and bad times, and people make decisions that play out in different ways. So I guess it's the divisions. I'm interested in the complexity and the gray area and trying to tell those stories rather than the kind of great moralistic, this was good, this was bad. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, no, definitely. It's something I did love about your books is that you talk about relationships, and loads of people do, but there's something very different about the way you do it, I think.
Thank you. That's very kind.
So, I mean, what's next? What's you working on now?
Working on book 3, quite different, not contemporary, not at this moment in time, at least, told through many different characters, but actually just through one character. But it's early stages, so I'm taking my time with this one, which I think is good. It's uncomfortable, like sitting with something for so long, but I think it's very hard to write books very quickly. So I think it's probably for the best to sit with it for a while. But it's interesting talking with you and hearing what you've taken away from the books, and I suspect there will be things that are common threads, even if it's a story set 100 years before.
A story 100 years in the past. I mean, there is a slight link there, I suppose, in that you've got the past workings of the two houses anyway. But the most thing that's the connection, I think, me as a reader, I suppose, enjoying your work is your prose anyway. So, you're writing it, it's going to be good. It's going to sound lovely.
Thank you. That was very nice to hear, especially as you're sort of sitting looking at a Word document going, gosh, this feels like a Word document. It doesn't feel like a book yet. So that's very kind.
So, these dividing walls and the two houses are published by Hodder. They're out now. Links are in the episode description. If you have enjoyed our discussion, do subscribe to the podcast for further episodes. Fran, it has been awesome having you here and learning all about your books, and just hearing that bit just beforehand about the complexity of relationships in particular was great. Thank you for joining me today.
Not at all. It's been my pleasure, and you are a very attentive reader and ask very, very smart questions, which is good for all writers, I think, to be put through their paces like that.
Join me at the earlier date of Wednesday the 4th of March, when I will be talking to debut novelist Camilla Bruce about her forthcoming gothic thriller, You Let Me In. The Wormhole Podcast, Episode 9, was recorded on the 19th of February and published on the 24th of February 2020. Music and production by Charlie Place.